fatty about Cincinnati. What a team, what a team, what a team. Each man and lady from 1 to 80, how they scream, how they scream, how they scream.
Hi, this is Jack Greiner. I'm here with my friend Randy Freking for the We Love Our Team podcast, and we're delighted today to welcome as our guest John Erardi. John's a former sports writer who covered the Reds for a number of years for the Cincinnati Enquirer. He's also a prolific author. He's written some great books, including Tony Perez, From Cuba to Cooperstown, Cincinnati's Crosley Field, Wire to Wire, and the Big Red Dynasty, among others. So, John, welcome.
Hello, Jack. Hello, Randy. Pleasure to be here.
We're happy to have you. So, John, you are a little different than some of the other guests we've had in that you are not a lifelong Reds fan. You grew up in Syracuse, New York, right?
Right. And I was just thinking of this today, Jack, that I was very much aware of the 1961 World Series between the Yankees and the Reds, but I more favored the Yankees because of Maris and Mantle. And I remember having a baseball card as a kid that had Vada Pinson and Frank Robinson. I remember thinking, I was probably 10 or 11 years old. I remember thinking, these guys will never win it all. They don't have enough pitching. And we're still talking about the same thing today.
That's right.
Right. John, not to digress too much, but I think Vada Pinson is one of the most underrated Reds of all time. His statistics are unbelievable.
I agree with you. He has a pretty good case for the Hall of Fame. I don't think he'll make it, but hopefully he'll get considered by one of those veterans committees someday.
Yeah, that was quite a. I mean, that was quite a 1-2 punch that they had in the late '50s and the '60s. So, were you a Yankees fan growing up, or where was your allegiance as a kid?
My allegiance was twofold. Because of Willie Mays, I was actually a San Francisco Giants fan, and then because we had the Detroit Tigers AAA affiliate in Syracuse, I was a big Tigers fan. And by the way, that was a very good team because when I was writing the Tony Perez book, I noticed that in that same league, I think it was the Sally League that Tony played in with Macon, the Macon Peaches. Another team had Mickey Stanley, Jim Northrup, not Gates Brown. I think Willie Horton, probably Northrup. So anyway, my point is that I was a big Tigers fan because the ballpark, MacArthur Stadium, was about a mile from my house, and my brother and I, who's 20 months younger, we'd ride our bikes down to the ballpark and catch a Chiefs game, and they were a great team in the early to mid '60s because in 1968 they of course won it all, beating the great Bob Gibson in the World Series.
Right.
Did Denny McClain pitch for Syracuse Chiefs?
I don't believe he came through there. They seem to get a lot of the position players and not as many of the pitchers, but yeah, for sure between Lolich and McClain, what a great staff, and everybody seems to think that the Cardinals won that World Series because Gibson pitched so great.
Right.
It's kind of like the Red Sox winning the Game 6 of the 1975 World Series. People think Boston won it, but there's always that Game 7. You got to watch out for that Game 7.
Johnny Bench has said that Boston won the '75 World Series 3-4.
That's right.
And that's funny. It's interesting, you mentioned the AAA team there because I think the Reds for a while had a Buffalo, weren't they? Didn't they have a affiliate in Buffalo? Didn't Bench play in Buffalo?
Well, Bench played in Buffalo. It's funny because when my dad was growing up, guys like Johnny Vandermeer came through Syracuse. They were a long time. Syracuse was a long-time farm club of the Reds, mainly, I think, in the 30s and 40s. But, yeah, you're right. I don't know that Buffalo was a long-time affiliate of the Reds, but certainly you're absolutely correct. Bench played in Buffalo, and I think Bench's uniform or number was retired almost in every minor league stop he had. He was so good. But, he was definitely a Buffalo Bison.
Okay. I mean, he didn't have a whole lot of minor league stops, right? He was pretty young when he when he came up. Yeah.
Yeah, he shot up through the system just like his buddy Gary Nolan did. They weren't in the minors very long.
Hey, John, so how did you become a Reds fan?
I would say primarily it's kind of funny. You were talking about my pullover I've got on, which is the Cincinnati Reds Community Fund, and then my hat is the Reds Hall of Fame. So I tend to affiliate with those two entities, the Community Fund and the Hall of Fame, more so than the Reds themselves, because I covered the Reds for 30 years at the Enquirer, so it's pretty hard to wear the gear out in public, even now that I'm retired from the Enquirer, because there's a tendency to think of myself more as a critic than, say, a fan. I think there's a difference between the two, but deep down, there's no doubt that I'm a fan because, since I got to town in 74, obviously just before the Big Red Machine took off in 75 and 76, this was such an easy team to watch, and it was impossible to be in town and not to be a Reds fan if you were here in the mid 70s. So I'm a Reds fan. I'll admit it on the air here to you guys. And but generally, I would say that since I've retired, it's been easier to wear my allegiance on my sleeve, if you will.
Yeah.
Oh, they like hearing that.
That's right. That's right. A round of applause. A round of applause for that. It's got to be tough. You said, wow, that crowd. Randy, can you get that crowd under control? In your
come on. Settle down. Settle down. Well, hey, John, so when you're covering the Reds as a sports writer and you say you can't be a Reds fan,
right?
Explain to us how that's possible. That's like a judge. A lot of judges say I'm very impartial, and Jack and I think, well, you're not really impartial. So tell us about that balance between being the sports writer and trying not to be a fan.
Well, it's kind of funny you mentioned that legal reference, because when I was in law school, I remember I had a professor named Jack Worthland, and he always made that point. I think he might have been a mediator at one point. He said he listened to one side and said, yeah, that sounds pretty good. I think I'll side with that side. And then the other party speaks and he said, well, that sounds good too. I'm not sure which way I'll go. So for me, it's very similar to that. I think any journalist is going to have an opinion, whether they're covering a team or covering a news event. So you try to just take your personal feelings out of it and write down the middle. So that's the way I always approached it. But the biggest thing was, again, to be a critic. And I know fans can be critics, but when you're a journalist, you tend to have the critical factor come into play all the time, because your job is to basically interpret the quality of the team and the trades and the players on the team and the management for the fans. Because if you're a fan, you really can't separate the two. You have to be somebody who can explain what's going on. So for me, it was always more or less just trying to determine who was right and who was wrong and write it in that way. And if you're that way as a writer, it really is difficult to be a fan.
How about in the press box? Did you ever hear any other sports writers or anybody like cheer when something good happened for one team or the other? Or was that barred?
That was pretty much barred. I mean, I think the great writer from Chicago wrote that book, No Cheering in the Press Box, Jerome Holtzman. And anybody that cheered in the press box wasn't there for too long. They got a dirty look, and they were basically asked to tone it down. If they didn't, they had to remove themselves. And it's not too far-fetched to imagine things would be that way, because you would occasionally hear a cheer, and then when you hear a cheer, you kind of turn around and say, who infiltrated our midst here? Who is this guy or gal? And so you tend to think, tone it down a little bit. You might be rooting on the inside. Just don't express it too loudly.
Yeah.
Who was your easiest? I don't mean to ask too many questions here and cut Jack out, but who was some of your more easier interviewees on the Reds teams, or tougher ones?
I mentioned this the other day when I spoke to a adult ed class up in Dayton. And they were asking me who my favorite interviews were. And I said, it's ironic, because to me, one of the best persons in the clubhouse that I ever interviewed was Bronson Arroyo, and that is so rare for a pitcher because the pitchers are always very cerebral and well thought out, and they might have an opinion on pitching or on the staff, but when it comes to the team, they kind of stay away from trying to interpret the team. But Arroyo was great at that, and any writer worth his salt wants to have a go-to guy in the clubhouse. And I remember in '90 when the Reds won it all, the guy I went to a lot was Joe Oliver, a catcher, and I mentioned Arroyo later on. They were both great interviews. I was kind of surprised that Oliver wasn't an announcer after he got done playing. I thought he would be great at that. And I've noticed that guys that I more or less was drawn to during my writing career, one guy was Bob Brenly, the Giants catcher who later became the manager, the Diamondbacks, and Jeff, the Cowboy, Jeff Brantley. He was a great interview, fabulous, and I was not surprised to find him in the booth. So it's interesting how those two things go together. You're looking for a good quote, number one, and number two, you're looking for somebody that's got their finger on the pulse of the clubhouse, and those are some of my favorite guys. I covered the visiting clubhouse a lot, Randy, in the mid to late '80s when I first got on the beat, and had a great relationship with guys like Smotes and Tony Gwynn and Mike Schmidt, people like that. And you found out who the talkers were. And it was interesting because a visiting player might be more inclined to talk to a writer such as myself from Cincinnati than their own writers. So I got the benefit of that too. I had the best of both worlds really for a long time.
Did you ever have any run-ins? Anybody a little upset more than just a little bit with anything you wrote?
Oh yeah. I once referred to a ball hit in the gap in left center. I made the statement that Mitchell,
Kevin Mitchell.
Kevin Mitchell, I said, man, with him playing left field, that's the Grand Canyon of gappers. And of course, he asked one of the writers to invite me down to the clubhouse. So I got an earful on that one. And it was basically a lot of that kind of thing because I always felt like it was your job to rankle the feathers a little bit, put yourself out there. And if you got called on the carpet, it's funny. One day I mentioned Joe Oliver. We were in San Francisco, and I wrote a story about this party that Charlie Sheen had at his house out on the West Coast. And of course, you can imagine Charlie Sheen, who some of the people were at the party. So I wrote about this party the Reds went to and walked in the Reds visiting clubhouse at Giant Stadium, and Joe Oliver yells out, "Erardi, do you know how many lives you ruined this morning? Our wives are all calling us, talking about this party." I said, Joe, were you at the party? He said, yeah. And I said, well, did I misstate anything? He said, no, not really. I said, well, that's my job. Don't go to the party next time. You won't be in the story. But there was always that stuff going on. It was more or less a constant because you have to be honest. And Randy was asking about how hard it is to separate being a fan from a writer. Well, when you write stories like that, you're going to get called on the carpet, and not too many fans get called on the carpet.
Well, that's true.
John, Marty always talks about he had a kind of a special bond, I think, with the San Francisco announcers. And I wonder if you had a similar bond with any of the other sports writers throughout the country. Either somebody you would call for advice or someone you would just call and collaborate with.
Not so much call to collaborate with, although I did do some of that. But the big thing for me was, as a younger writer, I was so impressed because there were bigger press corps back then. LA had a big one. Philly had a big one. And they'd come in and they had a lot of camaraderie among them. And I remember when it came to the Philly group, you know, some guy might be grousing, a Philly writer might be grousing about, say, the team or some player on the team. And another writer would say, write it. Don't talk about it, write it. So I tried to adopt that as my mantra. And then the LA guys were great. They were just a lot of fun, very outspoken, and were occasionally known to bring a bottle of something into the press box. So I enjoyed their company. We had a lot of fun. But those are probably my best days in the late '80s. I'd say even before the Reds got really good. It just seemed like it was a good group. And nowadays it seems there's fewer writers and they don't have that great spot right behind home plate like we used to have. So it seems to be somewhat diluted. Maybe not quite as much fun, but I'm sure they have their good times just as we did. It's a real fraternity being a baseball writer, and it was so great to be a Hall of Fame voter since 1995. I just recently lost my vote because after 10 years of retirement, you give up your vote. You used to have a lifetime vote as a writer, so I think this past year was my last year voting, and I'll miss that. But I've always heard writers say that it's the most sacred, most hallowed job a baseball writer can have, and I took it very seriously. And I think all writers do. So that's something I'll miss for sure.
It's funny you talk about being called on the carpet and fans aren't called on the carpet, but with social media, it's possible. And I will tell you that it's an uncomfortable feeling. A couple of years ago, Amir Garrett was on Twitter, and he used to sort of frustrate me because I just thought a lot of talent, but he just seemed to give up home runs and walks, and it would just drive me nuts. And he puts on Twitter that he's looking for suggestions for his walk-in song. And he must have caught me on a bad day because I tweeted back. I just put on Twitter. I just kind of reposted it, and I said, "Is there a song called Throw Strikes?"
Oh,
And he responded to me. I mean,
wow.
he was like, "Hey, bro, I throw plenty of strikes." And my two sons were just completely mortified that I had done that, and it's become kind of a running joke about in our house about Amir Garrett and Dad shooting his mouth off. So John, I know what it feels like to get called on the carpet there.
Say you stepped outside your bounds as a fan and became a writer.
That's right.
I never heard a story like that. I swear. Usually, I had to laugh because a few years ago, Jay Bruce was upset at somebody yelling something at him, and he basically yelled back, "Get a life coach." And I thought to myself, "What's a life coach?" So I had to look it up, and it occurred to me that there's no way that fan knew what a life coach was because I, as a writer, didn't know what a life coach was. But yeah, it's the rabbit ears thing always got me, and it definitely applies to things like Twitter. I mean, I always learned as a young player, just don't acknowledge anything coming from the other dugout or the stands, and it just surprises me that a lot of the players today, and especially the younger players, they tend to have rabbit ears, and you cannot win that battle. And Amir Garrett wasn't going to win that battle with you, Jack. You got him good.
Hey, Jack, I'm not trying to one up you, but I was once down at the ballpark and I called Bryce Harper a baby after he got hit by a soft curveball and kind of walked down the first base like it was a big deal. And he was coming back into the dugout. And that's when I called him a baby, as he was coming into the dugout.
Yep.
And he literally gave me the finger, looked right at me and gave me the finger.
You got under his skin, and you were right because, if it's not a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, you shouldn't be crying about it.
That's right. John, you covered, I think, two of the most interesting characters in Reds history, and there have been a lot of them, but I'm thinking about Marge Schott, and I'm thinking about Lou Piniella, and I just think that for different reasons, I just think of those as almost larger than life characters. Just what was it like with Marge?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned those two together because when Lou first came to town, and we knew the Reds were interested in hiring him because Steinbrenner would always recommend the Yankees guys to Marge because Marge and Steinbrenner were tight. And we didn't really know for sure Lou was interviewing, but when I called Lou, I said something to him like, "So how'd you like the St. Bernard?" And he started laughing. And I said, "I know you were in town, Lou, because I'm sure if Marge was interviewing you, she had that St. Bernard nearby just to make sure you liked her dog. And he laughed and he kind of acknowledged that he was here in town and interviewing. But those two, to me, were an interesting combination because, on one hand, Marge was kind of silly with the dog and such, and would try to, rub the dog hair on Lou's chest on the uniform and all that. And he really didn't want much of a part of that. But she recognized that he was great at selling tickets. And Steinbrenner is the one that convinced Lou to actually become more outgoing, which was natural for Lou. But he wanted, Steinbrenner wanted to show by the managers with the umpires for the fans, and Lou was great at that, and Marge appreciated that too. So I just think they were a good combination. And let's face it, she is the last owner to win a world championship, so we have to give her due in that regard. But she was a lot of fun to cover. I know that I used to phone her up a lot at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night after she'd had a couple of vodkas. And the lips tend to be a little loose, but I never crossed her in terms of saying anything out of sorts, but I would honestly quote her, and she gave me a lot of great interviews. And Lou was the same way. Lou was actually more cliched than Marge, but he couldn't. He really didn't have a big filter between his mouth and the writers, so he would let things loose a lot of times. So they were both great. I enjoyed covering them both. I mean, I thought Pete Rose and Marge were great together, and I thought Lou and Marge were great together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you called in your book with Greg Rhodes, I think you called Frank Bancroft the father of opening day back in the 1880s.
Yeah.
And I know, I don't know if I stole this from you, John, or not, but I often referred to Marge as the mother of opening day because she really revitalized it when she took over the ownership of the team.
Yeah.
The opening day celebration.
No doubt about it. Frank Bancroft was that way. A former Civil War veteran. He actually ran the first great opening day here in 1895. And I remember I covered the club in 94, and Marge, she wanted to be the first game. And MLB said, okay, you can be the first game, but it's going to be on Easter Sunday night. And Marge said, no, we're not going to be the first game on Easter Sunday night. But they made her do it, and she did it with no hoopla whatsoever, just a basic baseball game. And then the next day, Monday, here come the ushers and the tuxedos, and they got the elephants and all that. And she knew how to separate the two. And that was a great stroke of genius by her to make sure Cincinnati's opening day was on Monday afternoon at that time, not Sunday night. So I thought she was wonderful for opening day. And I've never used that mother of opening day line, but I think it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
She actually had the parade on that Monday morning. So that's the one.
She did.
One time the opening day parade was before the second game of the season.
Yep. And I tell people that, Randy, I say that everybody has opening day. There's 30 major league teams, and at some point they're going to have an opening day. But as Lenny Harris once said, he said, a lot of opening days are great in MLB, but there's something about those elephants in Cincinnati. I think Lenny had it right.
He did.
Well, no Randy was telling a story the other day about skipping school, saying he had a dental appointment on opening day, and running into the vice principal of St. X High School who wanted to know how the dental appointment went. And,
that's funny.
A lot of dental appointments and a lot of funerals on opening day.
Yeah, a lot of grandmothers dying multiple times on opening day. But one of my favorite stories on opening day was actually Buddy Bell. When Gus played here, obviously Buddy could get tickets for any game, but he used to climb the fence with his buddies on opening day just so he could feel like a fan getting into the ballpark clandestinely, which I thought was great. And it's the other interesting interview. I had an interesting interview with Barry Larkin one time. I said, because I did that opening day book, and I said, Barry, did you ever go to opening day as a youngster? He said, well, if I went to opening day, wouldn't that mean I had to miss school? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you weren't missing school with my mom and dad.
Oh, wow.
You were not getting to do that. So that Larkin family was a good tight knit family, but at least I got a Hall of Famer out of the deal.
Yeah.
Hey, John, tell us a little bit about your experience writing the book Cuba to Cooperstown about Tony Perez. I thought such a fascinating book.
Thank you very much for saying that, Randy. That to me, that was the old labor of love thing, because I did get to go to Cuba for 10 days. I had just retired a year earlier from the Inquirer. In fact, it's kind of funny. Jack will appreciate this. Every time I get introduced by somebody for a speaking engagement, they say, "This is John Erardi, retired, from the Cincinnati Inquirer." And I always say, "Time out. I wasn't retired from the Cincinnati Inquirer. I was retired by the Cincinnati Inquirer." And everybody laughs. But, I basically took a year to get ready for that trip to Cuba. And one of the places I would go, I would go with my two buddies, because I went to Cuba with them. We'd go make our plans for the trip, and we wind up going to craft breweries. And my wife says, "Are you ever going to stop going to craft breweries and just actually go to Cuba?" And so ultimately I did, and that was so much fun, because I still do presentations on that book, on that trip. I'm doing one April 4th in front of the Metropolitan Club of Covington. So it was a great benefit to me to go see Tony's hometown, his school, his home, and just hang out in Cuba. I saw a ball game in Tony's hometown. The ballpark wasn't there when Tony was growing up, but just a lot of fun, very animated, typical Cuban fan lifestyle, just people having a great time with these visiting ball clubs coming in from other little villages. So it was a great trip. I really enjoyed doing that book. And, maybe someday I was hoping to do a book on David Concepcion and go to Venezuela. But my traveling buddy who went to Cuba with me said, "Well," he said, "before we go to Venezuela, let's go to North Korea, because I'm going to go to North Korea before I go to Venezuela. It's much more dangerous than Venezuela." So I'm not sure I'm going to get to Venezuela and do that Concepcion book, but that is a dream. And of course, Tony and Davey are very tight, and Davey was just instrumental in helping me do that book. So I love both those guys. And the other guy I love is Cesar Geronimo. I went to the Dominican Republic in 1985 to do a book on, not a book, but a series of articles on the Big Red Machine. And Cesar was just great. So for me, those were three of the great interviews of my time covering the Reds: Cesar Geronimo, Tony, and Davey. Just three great guys, all happen to be Latino, but just wonderful human beings. Love them all.
You know Spanish?
A little bit, just enough to get by, just enough to be dangerous. In fact, I was when I was in Cuba. I was telling this story the other day. I was talking to the second baseman, Luis Zejas is his name, Havana Sugar King, back in the late 50s, and he played with Leo Cardenas. And he knew no English, and I only know a little bit of Spanish, and I had an interpreter. But Louis and I talked for 10 minutes with nothing but hand gestures and pantomimes and facial expressions. And the translator marveled at the fact we could talk baseball for 10 minutes and not know one another's language. But that is the beauty of baseball. It's universal. And that was another reason I liked going to Cuba, was that I saw a lot of Reds caps down there, not the Cuban national team, which tends to have a little bit of a wing on the sea, but I saw some Cincinnati Reds caps. And that, as you know, the Reds franchise was just huge in Cuba in the 1950s. And that's one of the stories I'm going to tell on April 4th. Had Castro not come in, the Reds would have had a stranglehold on that island and would have owned that place for the foreseeable future. And in fact, in 1954, the four players they brought to camp in Georgia, Douglas, Georgia, to be looked at were Cookie Rojas, Leo Cardenas, Tony Gonzalez, and Mike Cuellar. Those four guys, which was the Reds' first year as a AAA affiliate, those four guys played 59 seasons in the big leagues. And, two of them got traded. Of course, I wish they hadn't traded Cuellar. It just took Cuellar a while to develop. But Cardenas was a really good Red. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Gonzalez might have brought them Wally Post from the Phillies. So that was a big benefit, too. So it's just a close marriage between the Reds and Cuba. So thanks for asking that question.
Well, the Cuban players, I mean, I just think, I mean, they had to deal with the discrimination here in the United States because of the color of their skin, and then, not able to go home in the off season. The fact that any of them succeeded and some of them succeeded wildly is just amazing. I mean, really, reading your book, um, which is phenomenal, but it makes you appreciate Tony Perez that much more. I mean, we saw this guy, this leader in the clubhouse, this performer on the field, and just having to, what was he, 20 when he couldn't go back home again, or early 20s probably, right? I mean,
and John, isn't it true that I seem to recall from your book that his parents never saw him play in the United States, or it took a very long time?
Never saw him play. Never saw him play an inning of professional baseball on any level. He left. He signed in 1960 for $2.50, which was the price of a visa. He always went home after the first 3 seasons. Well, what happened after before Macon was 63, Cuban Missile Crisis was 62, and Tony's dad told him, "Look, son, this time you better stay because you won't be coming back home. Because if you come back home, you'll be staying home." And that happened to some players. Tony made the decision after that season in Macon to stay there, but he was actually 5 weeks late getting to Macon because they had trouble with his visa and everything else. And he became very close to Lee May after the Macon season. And the late Lee May, one of my favorites, also would tell stories. He found Tony a great barbecue chicken place, I think in Macon or wherever they were staying in the off season. And Tony, of course, that reminded Tony of the yellow rice and chicken that he would have growing up in Cuba. So some of Lee May's sense of humor rubbed off on Tony, and the English rubbed off as well. And I think Tony, this is no exaggeration, he didn't get to go back home until 1972, right after the great playoff game in the World Series against the Oakland A's. But when he went back home, he brought 7 bags of luggage with him just to give out as gifts to people. And when he got there to Havana on a Friday night, he didn't realize that there was no people to handle luggage. So he had to stay in Havana for a couple of days with 7 suitcases. And ultimately made it home by train. And his father, who was more or less bedridden at the time, kind of almost had like a Lourdes type experience where he all of a sudden got energized and he was starting to walk again and walking down the street in Central de Violeta with his son. And the neighbors would make fun of him saying, "Hey, Mr. Perez, I noticed that all of a sudden you're walking because your son's back in town. What'd you have? Did you take the waters from Lourdes, or what's going on?" And Mr. Perez said, "No, I'm just happy to have my son back." So short time later, Tony's dad died, but he did get to see them and experience all that love back home. But 11 years he had to live without that. So when somebody says they gave up their life for baseball, well, nobody gave it up like Tony Perez did.
Wow.
You're right. Yep.
I heard a great story about Lee May and Tony Perez years, after they had retired, at the Green Diamond Gallery. And Lee May was saying, he was just digging into Perez. He said, "Boy, it was so good to go to Baltimore and get a real third baseman for a change." Apparently Perez said, "This is how Lee May played first base. Heat my glove, heat my glove."
Yeah.
Rose said that when he was playing second base and Lee May was playing first, any pop up on the right side of the infield, May would say, "Yours."
He's a smart man. Who was it that a man has to know his limitations?
That's right.
Was one of the cinema detective played by Clint Eastwood. Forget his name, but Lee knew his limitations, but man, what a hitter, huh? He was
He could hit.
fun to
Boy, he
watch.
could hit.
Yeah.
How about Tony's impact on the Big Red Machine, John, other than as a player?
It was amazing. It was so cool what they did with that mosaic down at Great American Ballpark, because it shows more or less that, yeah, we talk about the big four, and usually Tony Perez is ranked fourth in that order, but in that mosaic, he's number one. He was the leader, and just had such a great way about him in the clubhouse. I told this story the other day that if you can be funny in one language, that's a great gift. But Tony was funny in two, and Jose Rijo was the same way. And I just thought Tony knew when to give the needle, and they'd always talk about him giving the needle and then stepping back, more or less being an instigator, especially kind of getting it going with Joe Morgan when Morgan first came in, and Perez made the point, nobody would have known who you were until you got traded to the Cincinnati Reds. And it was true. Joe kind of came to life here, and Tony was a big part of that, as was obviously Pete Rose. So Tony deserves so many kudos. But people who say that the team fell apart after Tony got traded, well, what fell apart was the pitching, especially the starting pitching. Had this pitching been as good as it was in 75, 76, that team might have been back in the World Series in 77, but it fell off a cliff. And it didn't have much to do with Tony leaving town, because Danny Dreesen's year for the Reds in 77 was just as good as Tony's was up in Montreal. So don't blame it on Hausum, blame it on the pitching staff.
Well, except that he traded him for Woody Fryman, so maybe there
Well,
was.
there you go. Woody wasn't much use here either. So maybe you're right.
He just wanted to be a tobacco farmer, I think, by the time he got to Cincinnati.
Yeah, that's true.
Hey, John, I love Marty Brennaman. So I'm just kind of curious about the interaction between sports writers and broadcasters. Was there a lot of interaction? Did you talk to each other before or after the game, or collaborate?
Marty was great to me. As far as announcers go, he was the best. And Nuxhall was great too, because he gave me so many great stories for the opening day book. And whenever I had to talk, because I wrote a lot of historical pieces, and I so loved that 56 team, even though I wasn't in town and wouldn't have been old enough to really to appreciate them. Post and Gus Bell, Frank Robinson, Big Clue, and Joe was so good talking about that team, was such a close friend of Wally Post. I really appreciated Joe. And Marty, I still miss Marty to this day, because for me, I tend to listen to the games rather than watch. I might watch the game in the 8th or 9th inning if it's close, especially when back in the day when Chapman was pitching the Cuban Missile. I enjoyed watching him pitch the 9th, and I still enjoy watching guys pitch the 9th. But I'm very much a student of the radio, creature of the radio, and I miss Marty. He was just so daggone honest that I missed that. And I talked about separating the fan from the critical journalist. To me, Marty was a journalist, and nobody could tell him what to say. He was in charge. And I know that when he told me the story, I think it was Walter O'Malley referring to Vin Scully as the most important Dodger. And, Marty was the one who told me that anecdote. And I read between the lines. I knew how important Marty was to this franchise, too. And I think he's still missed. I enjoyed the guys in the booth today, but let's face it, when you've been brought up with Marty Brennaman, he's a hard guy to replace. He was very entertaining and just terrific in the booth. And what I would say about him, as good as he was at baseball, I thought he was even better at basketball. And he was a great baseball announcer. So that tells you how good he was at basketball.
Interesting. There is something.
He called the famous
radio. Sorry.
He called the famous UK Duke basketball game with Christian Laettner. Yeah,
he was great. And he made the point to me one time. He always felt baseball announcing was a lot harder because in basketball, you're just describing the action. I say there's a lot to it. The game moves so fast. But in baseball, you better have some stories. And Marty had stories, but Marty was also good at pulling the stories out of other people. That's why he was so good when the writers were on in the second. Yeah. He was just wonderful. He was the best. And, he made the point to me one time, a lot of guys they can do radio by themselves, and they're good at it. Vin Scully was probably number one at that, but Marty is really, he could do it himself, but he's great in a two-man booth because he brings the stories out of people. Really, really love him for that.
There is something about listening to the game on the radio. I got to say, I was laid up a couple of years ago and spent some time in the hospital. I couldn't get the Reds games on TV, and so I would listen. And I had not listened to 9 innings on the radio for a long time. And this was after Marty. This was Tommy Thrall and the Cowboy. But there was just something about it, you know. And I usually listen to the game on the radio when I'm in the car and snippets. But to start to finish, listening to it and just forming the mental images of what was happening, it was great. It was really fun. Kind of took me back, you know.
There's nothing like it. In fact, my son laughs. He says he feels like it's so anachronistic to listen to the game on radio, and I can't really think of too many things that go back to the 1920s and that are still around.
Yeah.
But for me, I said to him, well, when you see as many baseball games as me, and an announcer is describing a play, well, really, I've seen them all before, so it's not hard to imagine it. And I feel very strongly about that. There's two things I love about baseball above all else. I love baseball on radio, and I love the fielding gems. I love the defense. It's just remarkable, which sounds kind of crazy to say, being a creature of radio rather than TV, because you really do have to see some of these plays to believe them. But I do love the defense, and you know, I know Barry Larkin loves Ellie De La Cruz as the shortstop. He feels he's the Red shortstop of the future, and frankly, that's good enough for me. But Larkin was great. I thought Concepcion was even better. Jim O'Toole swore that the best shortstop a pitcher could ever have was Roy McMillan in the late 50s here in Cincinnati. You talk about an institution, Jack and Randy. Basically, they had a shortstop. They had 3 shortstops for 50 years, if you want to look at it that way. McMillan, Cardenas, Concepcion, and Larkin. I think those 4. And unless you have a great shortstop, I don't think you can be a great baseball team. And I'm hoping Ellie's the guy. I mean, we've gone through a lot of shortstops since Larkin left in 2004, and I'm hoping Ellie's the guy, and I'm hoping he sticks from day one. I hope he has a good start and a good year, and it all flows from him. So if that works out, that he's a Red for 150 games, I think this team's going to have a hell of a year.
I think you're right. I think
Jack, we're running out of time, but I think I want to invite John to come back again sometime, maybe in season 2 of We Love Our Team. I think we could talk for hours with John Erardi.
Yeah, it was great, guys. Thanks for having me. It's not often I get to talk to 2 guys who actually know just as much baseball as me. So I'm honored to be in your company, and I wish you well with this show. I'm going to be tuning in, so keep it on a high level. I know you will. All
right. Thank you, John.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
All right.
The whole town's batty about Cincinnati. What a team, what a team, what a team. Each man and lady from 1 to 80, how they scream, how they scream, how they scream.